SpaceX's anticipated launch of its Starship, the most powerful space rocket ever built, was a success. But if you were watching, you might have actually been a bit confused. There were cheers and applause over the success of the launch, but there was also an explosion. Joining me now live is astrophysicist and cosmologist at ANU, Brad Tucker. Brad, great to see you. So it's now been over 24 hours since this launch. Do we know actually what happened here?
Look, it's going to be a process of a few months poring over that data, but a few clear anomalies have arisen, both that was visible and that have looked at the data. During the launch, we saw that of the 33 engines on this rocket, not all of them were on. I think at last count, there was 6 clearly that were not on. And in fact, a few had not even ignited, it appears. Also, a few flamed out. Now, this appears to be potentially some dust that was kicked up at the launch site. Now, in order to essentially put the rocket on the ground, they have this kind of ring system that the rocket sits in. Well, when the flames come in, that actually kicked up a lot of dust and debris, and that was actually why it was poor visibility to some people on the scene. Now, often you actually use trenches to help get the heat and energy away from the rocket as it's taking off to avoid that problem. So not only damage this rings that the rocket was on the ground, but clearly some of the rocket engines themselves suffered malfunctions. They've also looked at already that the second stage, where the Starship is, as we say, when it's attached to the rocket booster, during the flight and then right before it was supposed to separate, you could actually see that it's changed, and there was actually some visual things happening there. Again, what the source of what it was, they're not quite sure. So clearly a few problems have arisen. Some design probably, some maybe just malfunctioning because there are some improvements in the engineering a bit. So there will obviously be a little bit of work to do in both the structure for it to take off and then the actual sources about what happened. There's a number of systems involved that have already been mentioned. Pinpointing the exact one or ones will definitely take time. But look, they will get there. Obviously, it was a disappointment it didn't go all the way around the world. But it at least took off, and that was excitement for a lot of us. It took off to that 39 kilometers.
Absolutely. So it didn't quite get to how it wanted. But, I mean, has it set back SpaceX's program now? What happens from here on in?
Yeah, look, they were already planning to do a few of these orbital tests. That was always the schedule. The next ones are actually already in development and at different stages of being built. The real question, I think, is how does the long-term plans, how are they affected? Now, obviously, they knew they were going to test it. Not everything was going to work perfectly, including the way the rockets themselves would land. Eventually, these will be reusable. In the first orbits, that was not the plan. How long it takes to test all that and get ready, because there's questions of, well, they will get into orbit, it will work. When is that? Because once they get into orbit, then they can start sending people into orbit. Then once you start sending into people orbit, they're going to start sending people around the moon. That Dear Moon mission, this tourism mission essentially is already scheduled. But things like NASA's Artemis 3, the third NASA moon mission, are actually planning on using Starship to be the source, the landing for the moon missions. That the NASA Orion capsule will go to the moon, the astronauts will actually transfer to Starship and then go down to the surface. So instead of NASA building a lander, they're going to use Starship. So that is scheduled for sometime in 2025. Will that timeline be affected? Obviously, it's still early days, but there is some thinking that maybe some of these may be pushed back or affected because of the clear need for development and testing still in the Starship system.
Okay, well, remains to be seen then, Brad. Let's move on because, of course, this week was the total solar eclipse. Certainly a show for Australians, but plans are already getting underway for the next one. So it's in July 2028. So, Brad, if you missed this one, you're going to have to wait another 5 years. Is that right?
It is. 5 years does seem a long time, but, it's a few years down the road. And in this case, you're not going to have a huge travel to Exmouth. The 2028 solar eclipse, 22nd of July, it's going to start in Broome, come across the Northern Territory, southwest Queensland, northwest New South Wales, cutting across Dubbo, Sydney CBD is going to be one of the best places to see this eclipse, believe it or not. So this is kind of going to be the exciting one. The total eclipse, the length of totality, as we say, when the moon completely blocks the sun, will be longer. In Exmouth, it was 58 seconds. It's going to be closer to 4 minutes for this one. And because of the sheer geographical area covered across Australia, including obviously Sydney, there's going to be lots of excitement because there's just how many people will have an ease of opportunity to watch it. And obviously, as we saw with Exmouth, the tourism, there are tens of thousands of people from all across the world that trace these. So this will be a great chance for especially regional New South Wales and Queensland and Northern Territory to get a huge burst of tourism because they're going to want to spread to locations. And in particular, the western central locations of the country where the land and it's very dry, the weather, which means no clouds, which means great eclipse viewing, could really see a big benefit from this.
Oh, how exciting. Well, something to look forward to. So 5 years away, but still, I mean, if you get a good vantage point right in the middle of the CBD of Sydney, gee, you're pretty lucky, Brad. Now, Let's move on. New Zealand's Rocket Labs will reuse a rocket for the first time. So what's the process then to be able to reuse a rocket and then make sure it is safe to go again?
Yeah, look, this has been what SpaceX is doing and why they've plummeted the cost of launching into space. They reuse their rockets. That means you're not building it every time and saving money. Now, SpaceX does this by using thrusters, saving a little bit of fuel on board, and thrusters to steer it and guide it back down to Earth. New Zealand has actually been catching this. They've deployed a system of either retrieving it from the ocean as it lands, or even now testing a system where a helicopter mid-air catches the booster with a parachute attached. Now, once it lands, there are obviously, as you said, there's a number of checks to make sure there is no damage to the rocket himself, no systems that were failed. But the sheer fact is, even if there's a little bit of repair necessary or time in the checks, it is much cheaper to reuse the same wing with a little bit of maintenance than a completely new one, right? Just as if we have cars, the ongoing maintenance of a car, yes, it costs a little bit, but much cheaper than buying a new car every time, for instance. And this is another remarkable step in what the industry is doing. They have found a way of making their rockets reusable, and seeing their first rocket reused means that eventually they too can bring even further the cost of their launch services down. And that's the name of the game, space. The cheaper it is to get it, the more activity we will actually see, and then the more benefit from operations based on those systems that are now operating in space we'll see here on Earth.
Yeah, cost effective and smart, that's for sure. We're running out of time, but just quickly, NASA's Ingenuity Mars helicopter has completed its 50th flight. Quite a milestone. Why is this so significant?
Yeah, this is a remarkable for something that they weren't even sure was going to work. Flying on Mars is really tough. There's such little atmosphere. You don't get a lot of drag and a lot of lift for your helicopter. You have to operate remotely because of the distances. And, so many things can go wrong. So the fact that they not only did it once, but now 50 times, and it's a regular source of use for exploring Mars and aiding the searching for rocks and potential sources of interest for the Mars Perseverance rover, has completely changed space exploration. Future missions are now already planning drones to do the work. They are cheaper, more effective, and faster. And so it's really a big milestone in our space exploration of planets, and in the future, even places like moons of Saturn. So a big milestone for a little drone that has done so many things.
Small but mighty. Brad, good to speak with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.